Right, well, let's pick up on that in the next 40 minutes. We're running a little late, but we can still do it virtually to time, trying to finish at around 5 o'clock. Picking up on what Dominic Barton said about investment, about the potential for investment and where things go from now on. What are the real problems at the moment? So those are the things we want to talk about. And some of you have been here earlier and will have seen the way I like to do it. It's to hear the kind of ideas that you've got, not necessarily with a microphone, but also using that email address up there, asknyfa@gmail.com. That means I can get many more thoughts from you as the discussion goes on for the next 40 minutes. So please use your smartphones, your tablets, or whatever you've got to communicate. And I will try and get to some of you as well. But that's the deal for the next 40 minutes. Right, who have we got on the platform to help us move down that direction of the bridge between East and West? Now, I have to say already people are saying it isn't really a bridge between East and West. What about South and South? That this is perhaps old framing of the issue. So let me introduce to you now our 5 panelists from Saudi Arabia. Hamad ALMUTIB, who's Special Advisor for the Saudi Fund for Development. Miguel AZEVEDO, welcome, from Portugal, but Head of Investment Banking and Head of Corporate and Investment Banking for Africa for Citigroup. Welcome. Inyang EBONG-HARSTRUP, welcome, who Deputy Director of the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. So I've already got in your observation for the UNDP, the UN Development Plan process. And Regis TATAGANI, who is Minister of Economy and Investment. We've heard investment promotion. We've heard from you already during the conference. And finally, Sid OULD TAH, who is Director General of the Arab Bank for Economic Development. You've been in that position since June. So welcome. Critical issues here. You heard what Dominic Barton was saying. Some of you have been hearing a lot of the discussion, and please do send those messages if you can. It'll help me focus where we're going. What about the attraction of Africa at the moment? Miguel, can I come to you? Because you're focusing on Africa, you're acting on behalf of interested clients when it comes to Africa. What are you seeing? What are the challenges?
Very good. Well, the opportunity is definitely on Africa's side these days. There's the right demographics, as has been said here. There is the right level of macroeconomic policies that, with a few exceptions, but in the last few years, the macroeconomic side has been well managed, no major indebtedness. The economies have been growing, and that, together with the demographics and the urbanization, is creating needs for consumer goods, financial services, utilities. So the demand is here. The challenge is more on the supply side and getting the right level of capital to invest in all those opportunities.
What are you seeing in terms of the experience of IPOs and other interests in investing in Africa? It's pretty negative, isn't it, the experience?
It's starting. It's starting. You cannot say that there has been a very large number of transactions, but we have seen last year a few transactions. This year is a challenging year because of the oil price, but we are seeing companies being prepared, companies being implementing the right corporate governance packages that will attract investors. And at the end of the day, you need to have capital markets providing you the equity to go after all these opportunities. We are in the beginning of a journey. It's not an easy journey. There are a lot of things that a lot of boxes that need to be ticked in terms of governance, transparency, reporting, sharing, management. But I think we have very good and very encouraging examples.
But let me keep pressing you, because as we've heard from Dominic Barton, the world is changing very fast. The expectations in Africa, we've heard it for the next generation here. What are the obstacles you are facing which mean that potential is simply not being realized at the kind of speed which is necessary?
No, in a sense, what needs to be done in Africa is relatively simple, because it's really going back to the basics. It's really investing in agriculture and manufacturing. And you can actually see companies that are leapfrogging the technology issue. I can give you a very quick example. In the telecom sector, in Africa, you have telecom tower companies, very active, running the towers where the network operates. And given the lack of power, they were running on diesel generators. Well, now you see all these companies going for solar panels. And so it's really one of the few places where telecom towers are powered by solar panels. So that also creates an opportunity to leapfrog in technology and create good stories.
Okay, well, we'll come back to some of that. Let's go to the UN, to Inyang EBONG-HARSTRUP. Quickly, how are you seeing it from the UNDP point of view? You are responsible for South-South as opposed to East-West and North-South. What are you seeing?
Well, thank you, Nick. I think that from my participation here, one of the things that I haven't heard as strongly is that in the global economy, the new global growth poles, or the new growth poles, are in the South. And in terms of Africa and its growth over the last decade and a half, it's owed to three primary things: peace and security, stable macroeconomic frameworks, and of course, South-South trade. And I'd like to share a few a little data with you. In 2012, the developing countries accounted for half of the world's GDP. By 2020, Brazil, India, and China, with their combined output, are projected to outstrip Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Italy. In 2013, a South-South trade reached to 5 trillion, and 75% of South-South trade was shipped from countries in the East Asian region. Investment flows to developing countries, much of them originating from the South, reached a new high of 759 billion, 52% of the global FDI inflows. And finally, developing countries now account for more than a third of global FDI outflows. So that's what I want to share with you.
We heard from Miguel that there is still a resistance, worries about governance, worries about so many things, and therefore the potential is not being realized. Is that how you're seeing things in the UNDP?
No, I mean, we seem to think, or we feel that there have been improvements in governance, institutional building, and trade. But one thing you must realize, you take a big partner like China and its interaction with the South. The issues of governance, for example, are not the same, handled with the same conditionality that it is with the North. So they're getting on with the investments, and Africa is making the kind of changes in infrastructure, maybe not as fast as East Asia, but they're making the kind of strides in infrastructure that you'd expect to see.
Hamad ALMUTIB, your view from Riyadh of what is happening. You are looking around with your sovereign wealth funds. You're looking around to see what opportunities there are. How are you assessing Africa? Because one can feel the anchor chain still dragging when it comes to investment opportunities. And as you consider the answer, please, if you've got any messages, can I remind you, ask to the Ask NYF. Can we see the address up there? Ask nyfa@gmail.com, please, because time will beat us otherwise. That question about how you're assessing Africa.
Well, actually, our line of business is to support development projects more than investments. We are the main channel of the government of Saudi Arabia to provide assistance to developing countries rather than investment. And we are active in 82 countries, and from Cuba in the west up to China in the east. And we are coming here to find how to cooperate here to support the development programs here. And I just want to say one thing to our brothers and sisters in Gabon, that the Saudi fund is coming.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
we intend to support government programs and projects in infrastructures like education, like health, like roads, whatever the government thinks that is important. And we are very thankful to have this opportunity to come here so that we start our programs in Gabon.
Let me, in that case, go to Sid OULD TAH. You were, before you took this job in June, you were the Mauritanian Minister for Economic Affairs and Development, so this is really in your DNA. When you look at the challenge, but also, dare I say, frustrations and realities, and I think you have a potentially close connection with the Saudi support, where are you seeing it? Because it's easy to be optimistic, but actually you've also got to be pragmatic and realistic.
En fait, votre question met en exergue l'importance
Your question
de la vision
shows
de l'Afrique.
the importance of the vision of Africa, of new Africa, this Africa which is changing and developing fastly. It is true to say that
L'afro-pessimisme a régné pendant de longues décennies.
pessimism has been around for years.
Une opinion largement partagée.
Today, a very widely shared vision is that this is now time for Africa, the century for Africa. Africa has all assets to really take its place, particularly thanks to its resources and wealth and human capital, and to its true position in the world. Now, the topic about East and West, and the bridge between East and West, shows exactly the strategic position of Africa. If we move backwards in time, we can see that the number of summits that took place between Africa and different partners is quite impressive, and no continent showed such interest. Just to give you an example, in 2014, there was a summit between Africa and the United States for the first time, a summit between Africa and the European Union, between Africa and Turkey 2 years ago. It was in between Africa and Japan, 3 years ago, Africa and China. This year, Africa and another region of the world. We will also have an Arabo-African summit. This shows the importance of Africa in the world.
But if I could just interrupt, when we listen to Miguel and the realities being faced by the investment community, there's great potential. We've heard it here, but actually the reality is that a lot of the bankers and a lot of investors are not convinced at the moment.
Il faut faire la différence entre la
You
perception
have to differentiate between the perception that some investors, the way investors see Africa, and the reality on the field for those who know well Africa. A certain number of investors who knew before Africa are now fully investing in Africa. Now, of course, there are obstacles for investing, deficit in infrastructures, deficit in energy, and a certain number of hindrances, bad adequation between education and the needs of the private sector. Having said that, these are opportunities for investors. If you take energy, Africa has 12% of gas and oil reserves, but produces only 3% of electricity, of electrical energy. But still, it is a continent which can take on board investments in energy and electricity.
Right.
Just look at the large groups, international groups with the interest in Africa.
Before I go to the Minister, Miguel, I've got to come back to you. Given how you were expressing probably in a quite a cautious way, the reluctance of people still to invest. Here we've got the word opportunity coming up time and time again. It's happened here for 2 days, but still there's this reluctance. What has got to happen to make this move much faster in a much more determined way, which can be of benefit to African nations, rather than this, you're based in London, but rather than this caution of looking but not really going much further?
No, let's get this right. I'm talking about capital markets, so I'm not talking about trade, I'm not talking about foreign direct investment, I'm talking about companies in Africa owned and managed by Africans from many countries, assessing the international capital markets. Assessing the international capital markets, i.e. the stock exchanges for bonds or for equities, is a difficult business for any company around the world. There are certain rules, and the rules are not going to change just because a company comes from Africa. And that requires certain preparation, that requires certain commitments, and some companies don't want to do it, some companies cannot do it, and some companies can do it. We have seen last year, for example, one Nigerian company called Seplat, which is a local oil and gas company in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, onshore, issuing 500 million of equity into the London Stock Exchange. That has never happened. So there are good stories. Now, have we seen 10 transactions like that? No, just one. Is it simple? No. It requires education. It requires showing investors that the companies are solid, the companies are properly managed, the interest between managers and shareholders are fully aligned. And because it is new, it is faced with some scrutiny. But that's not because they are African, it's because Africa is, in fact, obviously with the exception of South Africa in that respect, is starting this journey as other areas did it a few years back.
All right. If you've got any questions, please put them to me, because we've got 25 minutes left on this critical issue. Minister, let me put these words to you, which we've just heard from Miguel. Preparation, commitment, and scrutiny. How can this be overcome, these limiters at the moment, when it comes to the greater interest in the way that Miguel has described?
First of all, I would tell Miguel that we need to stop being frightened. Miguel took examples based on oil and gas. It is true that the drop in oil prices today triggers anxiety within investors and banks. But Africa wants to stand apart. Africa has resources. Africa has potential. And according to forecasts, represents the future. We must already have in mind that there are other forms and approaches to development in Africa and other ways to motivate FDIs in Africa. And of course, to sustain other sectors in order to strongly reinforce Africa. Also, he said that our representative from the Saudi Development Fund said that they were prepared to help fund development projects. And on a par with private and public partnerships. For example, for farming products, if the Agriculture Fund today can fund a Gabonese company with Arabic funds, well, these funds will make it possible for us to benefit from market impacts at the level of countries in the East. And this is why we must absolutely see and focus on Africa on how we can, in fact, control and avoid the risks that can be brought about by the erratic behaviors of raw material markets. And when prices collapse, this is where panic occurs. So we need here to remember that this is a new approach. And I think that Africa today is in the midst of the consolidation between East and West. We would like to be the bridge to have both foreign investors from the East and from the West to develop the market, because Africa itself is a market. There is a Deloitte survey that was carried out a while back saying that Africa is increasing consumption because population is itself growing, and therefore the African continent is blossoming. So today we need to look at Africa from a different angle. We are no longer the Africa that went to knock on the door of the Monetary Fund to help us pay our debts. Today we are an Africa that is at the level of the East and West alike.
What I'd like you to do is, none of you want to send me any messages. If any of you want to use a microphone, can you get the microphones to you while we're discussing? Does anyone want to come in? One there, please. And could we get a microphone there? I'll come to you in a moment. But, Minister, we're talking about East and West, picking up the view from the UNDP. Are we actually framing this issue incorrectly? It is South-South. Because I note, for example, the volume of trade between China and Africa rose from $9 billion in 2000 to $211 billion in 2012. In other words, that's a South-South axis. Are we framing the issue in the wrong way?
No, not at all. You need to cover this in an integrated manner. East is wonderful. Many people like the East. So for us, this is wonderful. This is an opportunity. And when we see the number and the growth in transactions between Africa and Asia, this is a very positive point. And we can also perhaps relocate certain firms to Asia, for example, that now can return to Africa, because we consider that the East is an opportunity for Africa. This opens up opportunities. Today we want Asian enterprises to establish a presence in Gabon, in areas which can give us more competitive leverage, and also to be able to strengthen the Gabonese economy.
And from the UNDP's point of view, are we framing this correctly, talking about East and West?
I would like to hear in the mix a definite discussion about South-South, and not just China, for example, China-Africa trade. I think there's Brazil-Africa trade. I think, for example, within the region itself, those trade links can grow. And in fact, if I give as an example oil and gas, there is a move, and it's in the context of the government of Ghana, to bring emerging and established oil and gas producers together, precisely to share knowledge and information, build commercial opportunities, research and data, and to look into the areas of technology. So I think that this idea of South working together is something that, in this context, I don't think it's been totally explored and understood well.
Well, let me pick up. I'm getting some messages now. This from Christopher Marks. The challenge to African governments is to overcome the hesitations of investors, which we've just been hearing from Miguel, and provide a statement of commitment to efficiency and governance and return over time. Are they ready to, there's a bit missing there, something off the Eastern investors, control through privatization and equity ownership instead of hoping for debt? Is that, what's your view on that, Miguel?
I think really in terms of capital markets, we are still mainly seeing interest from Europe and the US. In the more recent times, we have seen some significant interest from sovereign wealth funds from the East, including China, but not exclusively, and also from the Middle East, definitely. So I think it's becoming sort of broader, the base of investors. And and that's it. So it really comes from a little bit everywhere, but the asset managers still, these days, are more in Europe and US.
And Hamad, are you wanting much greater discipline when that question comes in from Christopher Marks about efficiency and governance and return over time? In other words, a statement of a commitment to this.
To be frank with you, we are facing difficulties in African projects, transparency. And we are trying our best to control things. But things are improving. I mean, if you compare it a few years ago to now, it is little bit improving, and we hope that will improve better and better. Unfortunately, if the money provided by the Saudi fund, which is the government of Saudi Arabia, to assist people, if it is abused, it is not in the interest of anybody. Thank you.
When it comes to the Arab Bank for Economic Development, though, and what we're hearing from the other end of the panel, what are you saying to them about what has to be done to overcome these difficulties?
Actually, you know, it varies. It varies from country to another, to be honest with you, in Africa. For example, Burundi now is scoring good score in the transparency, for example, in our records and Saudi fund, compared to other African countries. We hope that other countries will improve. There is a huge bureaucracy, no doubt about that. There is a, what can you say, the problem is slow in action, in government action. You know, we are trying to help the governments how to improve, and how to be more efficient in utilizing the money we are providing.
All right, well, Sid OULD TAH, when you hear that from Saudi Arabia, which is a significant potential investor in Africa, what can you do now you've taken over at BADEA? What can you do to make it less difficult in the way that he's just described?
I think that the role of BAD is, of course, to give strong support to African countries that are the beneficiaries of this fund. We have a technical assistance fund, which allows us to improve the way in which administrations operate in terms of support, capacity building, and through programs that assist administrations in the development of their capacity in HR. I think that the issue today, in fact, is the reluctance of some investors to come to Africa, and particularly an issue of perception, which is the result of an image carried forward by the media. But the reality has changed tremendously over the past decades, and particularly over the last decade. And today, Africa offers excellent investment opportunities, which is why the Economic Development Bank, the Arab Economic Development Bank, is going to work on attracting investors, particularly from the Arab world, to Africa, to invest, support them, accompany them in discovering these investment opportunities, but also by demystifying the idea that is shown of Africa, pointing to an Africa that is not very attractive for investors. In reality, the African governments have made phenomenal efforts to create attractive investments. And today as well, Africa represents phenomenal opportunities. The work that we're going to have to carry out is one of communication, explanation, and accompaniment of the investors. And the Arab Economic Development Bank is going to work on this in the years to come.
Miguel, would you say the word is phenomenal or not? Would you relate to that?
I would say that on the debt side, i.e. loans and bonds, there has been a phenomenal growth. I would say that in the equity side of the business, not really. I mean, the growth was high because was from a very low base, but there's a long way to go, and I'm sure the markets will be there.
Right, you can see we've got 10 minutes to run. I've got quite a few questions here, so maybe you could give short answers. Matthew Smith, the CEO at École Rouban Vert here in Gabon. Within a disruptive context, how can Africa best maintain a sustained level of investment in workforces, both present and future, to generate growth? Minister, well, what about the UNDP view?
I've been listening to this whole notion of being disruptive, image problems, etc. But the fact is that not only you see a lot of major developed economies coming into Africa for all the problems, governance, institutions, etc. They're still coming. AGOA, for example, was here last week. Half of that, the Americans are quite nervous, for example, on the role of the Chinese, the growth of the South, and investment in Africa, for example. So hence, they were here. So I don't know. From a development point of view, I'm not that pessimistic. Also, what we've talked about is the government. We have not talked about the private sector and the role that the private sector can play in pushing the government forward. So,
yeah, that's been a very clear message throughout the last 2 days.
So I'm not as pessimistic.
Minister, do you want to come in on this?
Oui, d'abord, avant de répondre à vos questions.
Yes, before I answer your questions, I would like to return to the South-South cooperation to be strengthened, to benefit from the different opportunities. Yesterday, Gabon inaugurated GEOS, and this is part of the South-South approach that we've been describing. So this is also an opportunity for the South. This is something we need to capture. Also, since Gabon since 2010 has seen dynamic growth, and this is due to the investments that we have attracted. We have made efforts in this area. Also, the oil market, for example, is preoccupying as regards this growth dynamic that we're talking about.
But also, I've got a question here that says the IDB have funding available to Gabon, but it is barely used at the moment.
Non, première chose d'abord, on n'utilise pas les fonds dans le désordre. Nous avons une stratégie.
We don't use funds in a haphazard manner. We have funds available, but we need to know which funds to use in order to be able to control our level of debt. Also, we need to strengthen the different budgets that are in need of financial support. And we also need to work on public-private partnerships, and efforts must be made in this area. It is true that it is an obstacle to growth, but it is also an opportunity. Africa and Gabon, because Gabon is a case in point. We have also undergone growth. And certainly we know that we must implement different actions to be able to maintain the dynamic of growth and to maintain our macroeconomic stability and therefore allow the implementation of healthy economic policies. If this does not happen, then we can, of course, deal with a crisis situation, but in the short term, we need to absolutely control the efforts we will make.
The gentleman who's got the microphone, please. Yes, number 3. Anyone else want to come in with a... there's a lady there too. If you can get the microphone to the back, please. Microphone 1. Please speak.
Bonjour. Oui, en fait, j'ai un souci
Yes,
avec le titre de
I have an issue
la conversation.
with the topic of the conversation and the image that backs it up. So Africa between East and West. And here we see a bridge,
Deux sorties, donc c'est-à-dire une arrivée, une entrée.
one entry point, one exit point.
Une arrivée et un départ. Au milieu, on a
And in the middle,
donc,
there's nothing.
ça veut dire quoi, que l'Afrique,
So what
c'est
does this
vraiment
mean? That
juste un point
Africa is just a passway and that's it? And nothing happens there? Is that the image you're trying to convey? And then we have the Chinese that are in front with their helmets,
En général, des entreprises.
and they are at the head of enterprises in Africa usually.
I'm going to take that... thank you. I'm going to take that as a comment. Who have A lady with a hand up there, number 1, please, and number 2. Number 1.
Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Manaï Amel. I come from Tunisia. My question will be brief, but in 2 parts. I would like to ask a question of the UNDP representative. We need to cooperate absolutely with states and governments. But when we try to penetrate the private sector as regards investments, the state also needs to support us in this area at the national scale. Whatever African country is concerned, this in itself is an issue that we need to solve internally in Africa before we ask foreign investors to come in. If I were to now ask the second part of my question, we're going to come to a ratio between the risk that investors take in Africa. We've heard about political instability, lack of infrastructure, lack of training, etc. Is the ratio positive or negative? And what must we do to reassure and attract investors to Africa?
Miguel, do you want to take it?
Yes, I can take that. And definitely investors that look into Africa, they look into the trade-off between risk and return. And the trade-off is positive. There's definitely higher risk, but there's definitely much higher return. And that's what's happening. The trade-off goes up and down according to many factors. But investors will come for the ratio. And I think so far the ratio is bigger than 1.
Hamad, your assessment on this?
It is not our, area, but there is not much I can comment on this one, please.
All right.
UNDP myself. I agree with the gentleman about the bridge, and is it the East and West and Africa in the middle and the Chinese at the front? And I totally agree with that. And one of the things that we wish to dispel, especially when we worked in the area of oil and gas, is that, the emerging and the established oil and gas producers needed to get together and keep the big monsters, the Chinas, the Brazils, out of the picture, to sort out their perceptions of how they should manage these commodities. Now, in terms of cooperating with the states and needing help to approach the state, it is true that the states or the governments in Africa still have issues with governance and institutions, but believe you me, I, in my lifetime, have seen a growth and a change and a transformation that was not possible in the early days of my career and development. So I don't like the level of pessimism when it comes to talking about the improvements in governance and institutions. And I will repeat myself again. All these investors are coming. As Miguel said, a higher return. The risk is absorbable. So what are we really talking about in terms of this huge poor governance and institution building? I don't buy it, not from my knowledge of what I'm doing.
All right. Anyone else? No, right. Let's go to the question here on microphone number 2. Numéro 2, s'il vous plaît. Who wants to
Merci.
speak? Where are
Je
you?
suis Monsieur Moulambi de la
Thank
société
you.
civile.
My name is Mr.
du
Mwambi,
Gabon.
Civil Society
Je
of
suis
Gabon.
avec beaucoup d'intérêt les interventions.
I have followed these interventions with much interest, particularly that of Sid Ould TAH and of our Gabonese minister. I know that there is growth in our country, but under the public and private partnership, we
De la pauvreté.
must be extremely careful to avoid worsening poverty, because this may very well be the result
Mais sur les différents
if we are not careful. But as regards the different comments that have been made by the panelists as regards obstacles to growth in Africa, we heard yesterday that President Ouattara said that after the growth, after the crisis, we could reach 9% growth. And between 4 and 6% of growth in the future. Are we not facing precarious growth in this current context, such as armed conflicts?
Right. Precarious growth or 6 to 9%? What is the view around the panel? Minister first. Quickly, please.
Mais tout justement, ce sont les différentes actions que nous devons prendre pour maintenir la trajectoire.
Well, firstly, let's have a look at the different actions that we need to take. If you look at how growth is done based on raw materials and commodities, if you say so, yes, in Gabon, we have an environment and particularly a legal framework which helps sustain growth.
To my mind, growth is only precarious where there are deep levels of inequality. If we do not get the balance between those who have and those who do not have, if we don't get healthcare, education, employment situations right, then there is room for greater conflict.
And that's exactly what the UNDP was saying in the Human Development Report of 2003, 12 years ago. Miguel, 6-9% or precarious?
6% is precarious for Africa, 9-10% is possible.
6 and 9% is precarious, 9 and 10%.
And education is significantly increased.
What would you say about the potential across Africa, 6 or 9% or precarious?
L'Afrique peut croître à des taux même
Africa can grow with double-digit growth. It depends on the ambition that each country wants to take on board. It could be, as I said, 10% or even more. What is essential is to diversify production and to have ambitious investment programs, and this gives good results. Now, questions of gaps between different regions in Africa is very important. You have to have shared prosperity. The example of emerging Gabon is a very interesting one. This strategy is based on shared prosperity, and this model is more and more used in Africa, which should move towards diversifying growth and sharing prosperity. I am very optimistic regarding the potential of growth and the potential for sharing, because the African culture is a culture of sharing, and I'm sure that public policies are moving in that direction, and I'm very optimistic for the future.
Cautious element in here, no name for this person, but African governments need to adopt a more proactive stance towards investors. It will take more than a single window and open doors to get them here because of uncertainty. This is the reality of what diversification means. But in other words, being more proactive towards investors. How do you see that, Miguel?
I agree with that. I concur with that.
What have they got to do?
They basically need to get macroeconomics right. They need to get, the sort of things that the state is supposed to do, which is to provide infrastructure, to provide stability. And I think we have good examples, but there's definitely a long way to go.
What have they got to do, though? Can you create the beginning of a shopping list here of the critical areas?
I'll just go for the very first one, power. Make sure that there is power. You don't need to build the power. If you can build the power, even better, but create conditions for investors to invest in power, everything else will follow.
All right, one other question before we have to wrap up. Many young people's ideas and dreams, many people have ideas and dreams, and they die because of lack of startup funds. Angel investing is so scarce in Africa. International angel investors need to come to Africa because our African leaders don't seem to see what we are seeing as young people. In other words, we're seeing a generational gap here. Well, how do you see it in the UNDP?
Well, we do see that there is this vast growth of young people, but if we look at a country like Kenya, you can see that the government has taken proactive stands, especially in ICT, to give space to young people to engage in entrepreneurship.
But it's about angel investment as well.
Well, I don't really know how to answer that in terms of angel investment. I think that the governments do need to open up spheres like that. But I think there are other things that they seem to be so preoccupied with that maybe they haven't seen that role for themselves.
I mean, rather than the big infrastructure investments which you were talking about, the idea of angel investment, small investment for the next generation, that's what they're looking for. We've heard it time and time again in the last 2 days.
No, let's be realistic. I think there are some small funds, namely in East Africa, you have very good examples of that. Angel investing from investors outside Africa, it's going to be very difficult. These are small investments. People will not be able to follow that and to come and find those. So those will need to come from inside Africa, not from outside.
But there is experience in places like Pakistan and India on microfinance. Is that something that the big investors will be interested in, Hamad? Do you see that as a way of lifting the economy?
Well, I tell you, we are facing the same problem. We are developing country, Saudi Arabia. What's unique about Saudi Arabia, even though it is providing almost maybe #1 in the world in assistance to developing country, but it's unique that Saudi Arabia itself is the developing country. And we are facing the same difficulties, maybe the same here in Gabon. The problem of employment, the problem of small investors. The government is trying to establish small banks, but I don't think the Saudi Fund for Development is into this direction. Mostly the Saudi Fund is interested in mega projects, in development projects, I mean, huge one, not very small one.
All right, one last question from Charlene Abeyi. We talk about investment and financial aid. How can developing countries free themselves from the debts of other countries? What's the UNDP's view?
From the debts of other countries?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is where we look at in terms of trade as opposed to aid. We look at the whole regions. For example, if with infrastructure growth, power, as Miguel said, freeing of constraints in rules and regulations, if you can see Africa trading more and more with their partners, where does the need for anything other than strategic financial aid come into play? I do believe, as the minister said, that there are actually those who are willing to invest and the resources within. It is a matter of reaching out. Again, we're saying south to south, especially interregionally, for example, in Africa, to make those growth trajectories without resorting to loans.
Miguel?
Well, you know, I think that things can improve investment, and as a final statement, investors will come to Africa, investors are coming to Africa, but you know, there are certain rules that need to be complied with, and if you do that, the opportunity is immense. Everything is on the side of Africa, demographics, urbanization. So this is an exciting moment to be investing in Africa.
All right, well, look, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for all your questions. We're moving towards the final segment of the forum. And so can I thank the panelists? And even if we're still disputing the nature of that bridge behind you, I hope we've enlightened you on some of the major challenges for investment. Thank you.